Hi, and welcome everyone to this week's 1W-MINDS seminar. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ryan Murray, who's an assistant professor of mathematics at North Carolina State University. His research involves the calculus of variations and differential equations to study problems from statistics, physics, and machine learning. His research has been funded by the NSF and Simons Foundation. Today, we're pleased to hear him talk about a variational approach to studying dimension reduction algorithms. I'll turn it over to you now, Ryan.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks to organizers. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. This is definitely, I think, a somewhat different community than I often interface with, so I'm really happy to be able to share some of the problems I've been thinking about. As Kevin kind of mentioned, my background is kind of from the calculus variations and PDE, and so I'll talk about things in some of that language, but I hope I can talk about it in a way that's kind of accessible to people across different types of computational mathematics. This particular presentation, oh, maybe here I should full screen this real quick to kind of make that a little bit. Okay. This particular talk is about joint work with one of my PhD students, Adam Pekarsky. Towards the end, I'll also mention some kind of current work, both with Jeff Calder and with Kevin Miller, who's one of the organizers, looking at some kind of follow-ups on some of these things. So what I kind of want to start out with, and I'll maybe spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about this, is just talking about generally dimension reduction algorithms and some of the things that you observe in looking at these algorithms, and also what mathematicians I think can offer. So when I'm talking about dimension reduction, I'm thinking about this relatively broadly at the moment as any algorithm which takes data in a high dimensional space and tries to map it to a lower dimensional space of useful features. So this could include kind of very classical algorithms such as PCA or multidimensional scaling or stochastic neighbor embedding, but also kind of even more recent ones, things like autoencoders. And there's a lot of different goals that someone might have in doing dimension reduction. One goal might be to kind of identify useful features for a downstream task, such as regression classification. But then another kind of very common goal in doing dimension reduction in kind of the data science space is to try to explore or visualize your data. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are specific algorithms that oftentimes get used by practitioners to do data exploration and visualization. And something that I kind of want to emphasize is that these algorithms have really been kind of adopted by many different scientific practitioners in applied areas. And we don't really have good theory describing what these algorithms would do in many cases, and I think this is space that mathematicians really can offer a lot to help out. So I kind of wanted to start out with what I would call success stories. So this is places where these algorithms are able to do visualization and data exploration in very meaningful ways. And so, okay, at a data science, kind of talk, you always have to mention MNIST at some point. So here's our kind of classic data set where we have digits, which are represented as signals in kind of R800 essentially. And I can kind of plot them using, just like IMShow in Python. But if I think of them as signals, they're relatively high dimensional. And trying to kind of find an algorithm that can identify groups of these digits just using the original features is actually a non-trivial task, okay? In particular, if I want to take each of these images and treat it as its own data point, how do I visualize all of these data points kind of in one single plot that I can see? And is that algorithm going to help me to identify different subgroups without knowing a priori the labels associated with these images? So in this context, I'm really thinking of an unsupervised problem where I'm just given the value of the pixel's intensity and not the actual label that's associated with it, not the actual digit that these images represent. Okay? And so here, this is a graphic from the scikit-learn documentation. Some of you maybe have seen it before. Showing 3 different dimension reduction algorithms used to visualize this data set in 2 dimensions. So here in these pictures, each of these kind of little colored points represents a different one of these images here, okay? And these 3 different panels represent 3 different algorithms which have been used to try to embed this high dimensional data into this 2-dimensional space. So on the left-hand side, we have a truncated singular value decomposition, which is really, in many cases, equivalent to principal component analysis. And we can see here that if we look at the colors, It has done a good job of kind of keeping those each color represents a different digit. So this is something that you wouldn't see in an unsupervised problem, but it's something that as we're trying to kind of benchmark how these algorithms are doing, it's helpful to understand if these algorithms were actually able to separate these different classes meaningfully. So here, when we do PCA, you can see that the different classes are mapped to different parts of our kind of embedded space, our two-dimensional space, but they're not separated in ways that are very clear. They're kind of all squished together in some sense. And we haven't really found, in this case, this is just 6 digits from MNIST, but we haven't found the kind of 6 different classes by looking at this plot. A second algorithm, which is called multidimensional scaling, kind of spread things out a little bit better. There's kind of a little bit more space between some things you could kind of suspect there were clusters if we remove the colors here, but it's still not super distinct, and we're still, it hasn't really grouped these things into exactly the groups that we want in a clear way. And then this third algorithm, which is called tSNE, which, and I guess historically, sorry, PCA is very old now. MDS, was very popular and still is used, but it was kind of introduced in the 70s and 80s, I think, or kind of around that time frame. And then tSNE was introduced around 2008 or so. And tSNE here kind of kills this problem completely. It takes those digits and it completely separates them. They're clusters, they're beautiful. Like, this has completely succeeded at our unsupervised problem. Okay. Now, kind of moving towards things which are less toy problems and are more scientific problems that people are really trying to solve, tSNE and kind of some of its kind of subsequent algorithms that build upon it have become kind of gold standard in many sciences. So here, this is a graphic that comes from the Allen Brain Cell Atlas. It was featured in kind of in a paper in Nature. And what this is this is looking at kind of genetic data related to kind of a brain of a mouse. Okay. And the colors represent different metadata that this research team had associated with different kind of parts of this brain. And here, this kind of genomic data, like, you get really beautiful pictures that come out of this dimension reduction algorithm. In particular here, this is something related to tSNE. And you get these beautiful clusters and these shapes and all these cool things. Okay. And so in some ways, like, this is very satisfying. We have this very high dimensional data set, but we've been able to embed it in 2 dimensions in a way where we're able to see kind of underlying structure depicted in a very aesthetically pleasing way. Okay. So at this point, it's maybe good to kind of ask the question, when is a dimension reduction algorithm good? And when we look at this last one here, we can say, well, it's good if it generates pretty pictures. And I think that the mentality that's oftentimes used by practitioners when they run UMAP on genomic data is it generates pretty pictures. It's great. Well, I think that this is kind of a dangerous road to walk down if you're trying to do science, in the sense that a nice outcome doesn't necessarily imply a good process. And here, kind of in standard fashion, I provide an XKCD comic that follows the same lines. That, if you have a good outcome, that doesn't mean that you had kind of a sound process that led to that outcome. And so if I'm trying to think about what makes a dimension reduction algorithm good, I would like it to make data accessible for further analysis. So things like visualization, downstream classification, or regression tasks. I would like it to preserve structure of data in some meaningful way. And this structure could mean a lot of different things. I'll mention some of this later, but we could be interested in finding subgroups or clusters. We could be interested in topology. There's a lot of different things that we might be trying to get out of structure. I'm going to add kind of a third bullet point here that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, but really, if we're going to use dimension reduction plots as part of kind of a scientific endeavor, if I want to be putting this plot here in a Nature paper and say that something scientific is happening, then really I need to have outcomes which are stable or repeatable. If I'm seeing subgroups as the outcome of a dimension reduction algorithm, and those subgroups change on a new sample of my data, or a new run of my algorithm, then I probably shouldn't be reporting that as scientifically meaningful. And then also kind of a last piece that is very important in many practical settings is that you really want your dimension reduction algorithm to remove unimportant or confounding information, especially noise that might be harmful to seeing structure that's present. Okay.
Hey, Ryan, I'm sorry to interrupt. A a couple of us are seeing like the bottom of your slides keep getting cut off. I wonder if it's just how you've zoomed in.
Let's see here. Bottom of slides are getting cut off. So if I go like, no, let's
I see that you have fit width.
fit width.
Yeah, that fit page looks nice.
Will that do better?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, let's just try that. Thanks for saying something. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Okay, I hope that's visible. All right. Cool. So anyway, I would say that if algorithms fail to do some of these things, then it's possible that they're giving misleading results in some contexts and probably don't meet the standards for rigorous science. Now, structure could mean a lot of different things, and every algorithm which does dimension reduction defines structure in a different way. And outcomes are going to look different across all of these different choices of structure that you're trying to preserve. So I think that it's kind of important to kind of remind ourselves that if we're doing an embedding problem, if we're trying to embed a high dimensional data set into low dimensions, there isn't any single right answer for what it means to do that well. It just depends on what criteria we're writing down. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing that it gives us flexibility for capturing different things, but it also means that practitioners have to navigate kind of a wealth of different algorithms that might be measuring different things. And I think that we don't always do the best job of conveying and explaining why one would pick one of these algorithms versus another. So here, kind of to illustrate what this means, this is a graphic that comes from the scikit-learn documentation as well. This is an example where data has been sampled from the surface of a sphere. Okay, so that's this top left picture here. This is three-dimensional data that's kind of distributed along a sphere. And then there's a slice cut out of it to kind of seed things in a repeatable way. And then we run kind of different dimension reduction algorithms to visualize this three-dimensional data set in 2 dimensions. This is a toy problem. And I like this because in some sense, this is the cartographer's problem. This is the problem of trying to make a map of the world. And here we can see that some of these algorithms do things which, kind of align with what I would consider like projections that we see in cartography. So this kind of bottom left one here looks kind of like certain mapping projections that we might see. This one here maybe kind of does too. This one up here in the top left, I'm really not sure what it's doing. Like it doesn't kind of align with any like good mapping I would think of to take the sphere to a map. This one in the bottom right here is kind of the gold standard in many kind of data science applications. And it's also the ones that these kind of nature graphics were predicated upon. And it does some kind of funny things, and it finds structure that, may or may not be accurate. So these are just things to be aware of, and I think that there's a wealth of different algorithms available, and they're all doing slightly different things. Okay. Similarly here, if I take and distribute data, again, this is also from the scikit-learn documentation. If I distribute data along an S-shaped surface in 3D, and then try to embed it to 2D, and I use 2 different algorithms, one gives me this kind of square, which represents one depiction of the manifold structure. And then a second one creates this S shape, which is another very valid description of this shape structure. And depending upon what you're trying to capture and what you're trying to do with it, one might be more relevant than the other. So again, we have lots of different options, and a lot of it just depends on how we're choosing to quantify what it means to preserve the structure of our high dimensional data when we embed it into 2D. Okay. Now, even if we pick a single particular algorithm, you can get outcomes that may not be interpretable the way that you'd like them to. So this is from a paper from 2016 that came out of Google Brain. This is not my graphic. Where they have 3 clusters distributed in a kind of an uneven way. And then they run tSNE for different choices of a particular hyperparameter. So this is one algorithm with different choices of hyperparameter. And then we have different panes which represent the outputs after this optimization runs to try to find kind of the best embedding according to some notion of preserving structure. And for some choices of hyperparameter, we completely forget about the clusters. For other choices of hyperparameter, we've kind of found lots of different subgroups, and we're not, it's a little bit funny. And then for other choices of parameter, we find 3 subgroups, but we space them out evenly. So in this particular algorithm, and this is one of the points of this particular paper, they argue that the relative distance between clusters given by tSNE plots may not actually hold any useful information. All right, so here I have kind of the link to this paper. So this paper actually is really cool because it gives interactives. And now I'm going to do something maybe a little bit ambitious, but I want to show it. So here I can actually pull up this paper. Okay. So this is a graphic. This is not my graphic, but this paper is actually an interactive paper that you can go and you can see the tSNE algorithm as it tries to find a best embedding for different canonical examples. And something very curious happens for one of these examples. So here, what's happening is we're going to go ahead and, okay, so here, this little plot says that the original data is going to be an evenly distributed grid. And then we're trying, think about it as a grid that's been placed in some high dimensional space. And then we're trying to embed it into 2D. So this is really a 2D manifold when I'm thinking about this grid. It should learn something which looks like a grid. And what oftentimes happens is that it kind of takes the grid and twists it around. Oh, this one actually did an okay job. But if we run it a couple times, we'll see that oftentimes, so here did an okay job, oftentimes it will find and twist the manifold into different pieces. So here is one example where it took and it kind of drew a line across this grid, kind of a diagonal line, and then it twisted the one side of the grid when it found this embedding. So in some sense, like things like topology and relative distances between points are very strongly not preserved. And this is pretty weird behavior from a mathematical perspective. The identity should be the global minimizer that we find. We should just find the grid when we embed these points. But the algorithm somehow oftentimes finds these grids with, twisting that's added to it. Okay, so now I'll go back to my slides. I think that particular kind of that interactive paper actually gives a lot of really cool examples that let you see different things that can happen with tSNE and things that can go wrong. Okay, so there's actually, for kind of these more complicated dimension reduction algorithms like tSNE, it's actually pretty well known that in certain contexts you do get what I would consider to be failure cases. So here, this is a graphic that comes from a paper by Stefan Steinerberger and George Linderman, where they take, and their original data is data distributed along a line embedded in 3 dimensions. And when you run it through tSNE, just using the standard scikit-learn document, the scikit-learn implementation of tSNE, and you try to embed it into 2 dimensions, it creates this kind of funny-looking spaghetti plot, which takes and breaks it into pieces and has twists and kind of tries to fill up space. And a similar thing happens if you kind of create a Swiss roll in 3 dimensions and then try to embed it into 2 dimensions. It takes little strips of it, it twists them around, it kind of flattens them out in this kind of funny way. Okay. That's not to say that this algorithm couldn't find good embeddings, but in many contexts, it finds embeddings that might not be doing exactly what we think they're doing. Okay. All right, so this is a third example, and this was something that was really motivating for me and one of my graduate students. We were studying multidimensional scaling, and here is a very simple example where we take and we put a large number of data sets in or a large number of data points in 2 clusters in R2. So here the location of the points is actually the features. So we should think of that as high dimensions here is this 2-dimensional data set. Oops. And here the data is going to be 2 clusters, which are located along the y-axis. And then I have a third group of points, which is evenly distributed on the circle. Okay. And then if I run multidimensional scaling using scikit-learn, here the color on this plot represents where it has been embedded in 1 dimension. So I'm taking a 2-dimensional data set, running it through the standard algorithm in scikit-learn, and getting back a 1-dimensional embedded feature. Okay. And so here, what it does, if we kind of think of this color as that third dimension, that the dimension it's being embedded into, the 2 clusters in the middle are being embedded to roughly minus 0.25 and 0.25 in this embedded space, which is consistent with their location in 2D. But then the points around the circle are essentially randomly shuffled, and half of them are mapped to +1 and half of them are mapped to -1. Now, if I just look at the outputs, okay, I have 25% of the points at -1, I have 25% of the points at 0.25, 25% of the points at -0.25, and 25% of the points at +1. So if I was a practitioner and I just looked at the output of this algorithm, I would say, I have found 4 clusters, and they are well separated, and I have found subgroups that are meaningful in this data. But when I look at this plot here that says where the data came from, the 2 clusters on the outside were created based on random assignment. I took the data points on the circle, I essentially just shuffled them randomly and assigned them to one of these 2 clusters. This, for me at least, raises some significant questions about how much we can trust the subgroups or clusters that are created by some of these nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms. Okay, so this has kind of been all in the interest of providing some motivation and some kind of examples that I think are motivating for understanding this. As a mathematician, what are my goals in understanding this? And what's the goal of kind of providing more mathematical theory for these algorithms? Well, I'm a person who comes from this from the angle of the calculus of variations, and I think about these algorithms in terms of optimization problems. And one of the first things you do when you try to do optimization problems is you try to understand properties of minimizers. So you try to write down necessary conditions. And you try to say, what can I say about local or global minimizers of these problems? And of course, you have to specify in what sense you mean a local minimizer. And kind of questions that we can ask is these failure cases that we're seeing in some of these dimension reduction algorithms, in these nonlinear algorithms like tSNE or multidimensional scaling. Is this due to bad local minimization? Is this due to some failure of our optimization routine to rule out certain types of bad behavior? Or is this really intrinsic to the algorithm? Why are we seeing this? And can we understand it using necessary conditions associated with these problems? And accordingly, if we had better algorithms, could we try to avoid some of this behavior? A second question that I think is very meaningful that can be asked from the mathematical side is there a meaningful statistical limit of these procedures? So if I took more and more data points, is there some limit that they should go towards? Meaning that if I took enough data, would I get repeatable outputs from these dimension reduction algorithms? This would kind of give some credence to using this scientifically, because you would then say, oh, this should be stable if I took enough data. Finally, there's always kind of, I think, the potential for us to construct better algorithms that are more effective, more expressive, and less prone to failure. So this is kind of another motivation for trying to understand the mathematics behind these, is it should facilitate better algorithms as well. Okay, cool. So with that, I want to start with a first example. And this example is one that is probably relatively familiar with people. It's also the only example that I'm aware of in dimension reduction where we actually have kind of an explicit characterization of the solution, and we know exactly what we're doing, and kind of all the things on the previous slide about consistency and stuff have been done. So here in this, but I'm going to maybe pose it in a way that's a little bit different from what other people often do. So many people have probably heard of PCA. There's a statistical description for PCA in terms of describing a high-dimensional data set by looking for its direction of largest variance. I'm instead going to try to pose PCA in terms of an optimization problem, which I think optimization problems are maybe a little bit more consistent with how many machine learning and data science algorithms are posed. So here I'm thinking of a centered probability distribution, so it has mean 0. I'm thinking of D as this high dimensional space of features. It's whatever data I have available to me. And I'm trying to find a different distribution representing this data in Rm. M is much smaller. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a function T from this high dimensional space to this low dimensional space. And I have to write down some energy which says how well this T has preserved structure. And I have to define what I mean by structure. So one example of how you could do this would be to measure structure preservation in terms of preservation of pairwise inner products. And here I'm calling this energy PCA because the minimizer of this is indeed PCA. And what I do here is I just take the double integral, and then I have T evaluated at x1 inner product with T evaluated at x2. And then I compare that to the inner products between the original x1 and x2. And then I square that, and I integrate or take a double sum if you prefer thinking about discrete things over all of the data points. Okay? And one can take this energy here, and one can do a little bit of work, either in the discrete or the continuous case, and show that the minimizer of this energy is always a linear function. And it is a linear function which projects onto the m dimensions of RD that contain the most variance of the original probability distribution mu. So this gives us kind of a characterization of the solution, but I kind of like writing it in this way because when I start out with this energy, I'm not presupposing anything about t. It's just a function. But it turns out that the necessary conditions for optimality require that t actually be a linear function mapping the high dimensional space to the low dimensional space. Okay, and then here on the second slide, I just write that as a double sum. If you prefer to think of it as a double sum, that's totally fine. Okay, so what are pros and cons of PCA? Well, it's easy to compute. It's easy to interpret. It's parametric. I only need to learn this linear map, which is going to be a D by M matrix. The downside is that these embeddings are rather restrictive. And the fact that they're linear means that they can only capture certain types of structure. And so in particular, if I'm trying to look at this MNIST data set, the graphics that I get, the visualization and the subgroups that I'm able to identify from it really are not so compelling with PCA when I compare with some of the kind of algorithms historically that came out. Okay. So we kind of need to go beyond this linear projection model, this kind of simple model, and try some other things that measure structure of my data. Okay. So one kind of example that one could think of, instead of measuring pairwise inner products, maybe I should instead measure pairwise distances. And so here I've kind of written an energy in a very similar way. It still has this double integral. I'm still comparing x1s and x2s with t of x1s and t of x2s. All I've done here is now, instead of comparing inner products between x1, x2 and tx1 and tx2, I'm now comparing the pairwise distances between x1 and x2 with the pairwise distances between t of x1 and t of x2. So the challenge that arises here is that this is now a non-convex optimization problem in terms of t. And the existence of minimizers of this problem is actually, at least when we talk about this continuous distribution mu, is completely not obvious. And the way that we observe this computationally is that if I'm trying to optimize an objective function that looks like this, the way that this is implemented practically is for every x that I observe, I now create a variable t of x, t of xi, and I need to now optimize over all of those particles at the same time. So if you look at the implementations, at least the kind of most natural implementations, I would say, of things like MDS or multidimensional scaling or tSNE, what they do is for every data point, so if you have 80,000 data points in MNIST, I now have 80,000 times 2 parameters that I optimize over when I construct this embedding. And accordingly, if I'm kind of optimizing things particle-wise, continuity or single valuedness is really not at all enforced in these things. I can have embeddings that are highly oscillatory that map one point to multiple things. Like there's nothing that keeps it smooth and nice and single value. So this is kind of manifest in this example that Adam and I kind of studied before, where when you look at the optimizer that scikit-learn finds for this circle with the 2 clusters in the middle, it's essentially taking the circle around the outside and it's finding something which looks kind of multi-valued. It would like to map half of the time to this blue, this -1 in the embedded space, and half of the time it would like to map to this +1 in the embedded space, this yellow. And so one could argue that maybe this is evidence that at least in some appropriate local minimization sense, you don't need to have a single valued limit kind of when trying to minimize this function. However, I will point out that if you kind of think things through carefully, you can find a kind of nice analytic ansatz, which gives much lower energy. So it gives energy, which in this case is like 4 times better. But this is still a local minimizer, and it's what scikit-learn will find. Okay. All right. This also connects to optimal transportation. And so I just want to spend maybe 2 slides mentioning OT just a little bit. So in optimal transportation, you're trying to map a distribution first in kind of the original OT problem. You're mapping a distribution from RD to RD. Here, mu is a distribution on RD, and mu is also a distribution on RD. And you're asking to find a mapping which pushes the one distribution forward into the other. And you're optimizing over such maps, and you're trying to minimize this distance between x and t of x squared. This starts to look kind of like the energy that we're talking about, but it's not quite the same. There's only one mu here, whereas for our energy there are 2. Well, there's also what's called the Gromov-Wasserstein problem, which is kind of like the similar sort of thing, but now you're looking at mapping one measure space to another measure space. So here I'm thinking RD to RM, but you could also do something more general if you'd like. And you compare the pairwise distances between x1, x2, and t of x1 and t of x2. And so this is, this energy looks exactly like the one that I wrote down on the previous slide, with the added constraint that I'm required to match a specific marginal in my feature space. Whereas in the dimension reduction problem that I'm talking about today, you aren't required to satisfy this marginal constraint. I'll just mention that this dimension reduction problem could be seen as a projection problem in the Gromov-Wasserstein space. It's removing this output marginal constraint, so it can be thought of as projection problem. In both of these cases, historically, this Monge problem and this Gromov-Wasserstein problem, it's really difficult to show that minimizers exist in a direct way. Okay, there's a lack of convexity in terms of T that just makes it hard to say whether minimizers exist or not. And so the standard approach that people take to tackling this problem, which took a long time to figure out, but now is standard, is that you relax the problem. So instead of requiring that a single point x be mapped to a single point y, they now allow x to be mapped to multiple y's. And you construct what's called a transportation plan, or sometimes other places it's called a correspondence. Okay, so here now, instead of minimizing over a function which maps x to y's, we minimize over a probability distribution that represents the distribution of y's that a single x has been mapped to. Okay, so this is what's sometimes called the Kantorovich problem, and this was developed in the 50s for optimal transportation. And in that context, showing that there exists an optimal transference plan, or a pi here, is pretty direct and not too hard to show. And then subsequently, you do a lot of extra work to show that minimizers of this relaxed Kantorovich problem are actually induced by a mapping T under additional assumptions. And this is work that was kind of done, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s in the context of optimal transportation. In the context of the Gromov-Wasserstein problem, when we relax it, it looks like what's called the Gromov-Wasserstein problem. And this has received a lot of recent attention by a number of different authors, also on the computational side. And I only list a few here, there's many others as well. It's still unknown whether minimizers are necessarily induced by a mapping in that context. This is still a relatively difficult problem. Okay, so now coming back to the dimension reduction problem, we had a little interlude about OT for a second. If we come back to dimension reduction, I'm going to write down what I'm going to call a generalized multidimensional scaling problem, in which I'm looking for a mapping T, which maps RD to RM. It has this double integral. And then I have this general cost function, which takes as an input x1 and x2, and t of x1 and t of x2. So this would encompass something like that PCA cost that I wrote down previously. It would encompass what's called least square scaling, or kind of Kruskal-Shepard scaling, which looks at pairwise distances. It would also include the quartic MDS that I wrote down, or there's also salmon mapping, which is kind of a later version that tried to impose extra continuity by weighting differently. Okay, and historically, these were all kind of stepping stones that took us from something which looked like PCA to something which looked more like tSNE. So, okay, the thing I just talked about with OT, because we don't know that minimizers exist, so this MDS problem, the natural thing to do is to relax the problem. So here I replace the d mu, and the t's there with now a d pi. And then I have y1 and y2. And so once I've written down this relaxed multidimensional scaling problem, the existence of minimizers follows from kind of very classical direct methods stemming from, say, like probability theory. Okay. Once you've shown that minimizers exist, the first thing you do in any optimization problem is say, okay, then what are the necessary conditions? And in this context, for our relaxed multidimensional scaling problem, there's a very nice necessary condition that tells you a lot more. So here, what I'm writing down, and it's kind of helpful to kind of go back and forth between slides just a second here. So this energy here, this relaxed MDS energy, has two integrals and 2d pi's. So it's quadratic in pi. Okay. Here, I'm writing a new function, which is a function of x is in RD, and y, which is in Rm. And then I have one integral, and I have d pi star. So d pi star here, pi star is going to be the minimizer, one of the minimizers of this relaxed multidimensional scaling problem. And here I'm integrating out x prime and y prime according to d pi, using this cost function c, which represents my measure of how well I've preserved structure between my x's and my y's. And this jxy is going to represent now this function over Rd cross Rm, which measures this integral. And the theorem here says that if I have an optimal pi star of this relaxed dimension reduction problem, then the support of pi star has to be a subset of minimizers of this function. So if I freeze a particular x, if I look at a slice in x, then I have to be minimized in y. Okay. Now, what does this tell us? This is kind of, in some ways, analogous to what happens in control theory when you look at Pentragon's maximum principle, where for each time you have kind of a finite dimensional optimization problem that you solve for your controls. And so here, I look at this problem, and for each x, I have now a finite dimensional optimization problem in y, and the support of my solution has to live in the minimizers of this finite dimensional optimization problem. This really means that the support of pi star is really strongly constrained. For most x's, I kind of expect there only to be finite or maybe even just one minimizer of this marginal problem. And this idea really works across a very broad range of costs. It's inspired by needle perturbations, which come from control theory. That's where the proof idea comes from. So once you've shown that type of structure of this necessary condition, then it actually turns out that you can show that the minimizers of this relaxed variational problem were indeed induced by maps. So here, that's what the theorem says. If we have pi star, which is a minimizer of this relaxed problem, and the cost satisfies some mild structural assumptions, which pretty much every cost that I wrote down in the previous slides do satisfy. For example, if you have convexity in the difference between the y1 and y2 in the embedded space, then the minimizers are going to be supported on the graph of a measurable function. So kind of using the language from optimal transportation, this would be a Monge type result. We've now shown that this problem, actually the Monge problem for this dimension reduction has a solution. And any solution actually has to be up this one. The proof ideas come from using second order necessary conditions that would kind of use very specifically constructed perturbations to leverage to show that it can't be multi-valued. Okay. So this is good news. Global minimizers, and then I guess I should say here, this only says something about global minimizers. We don't. It doesn't say something about local minimizers found using, for example, the particle-wise computational methods that I kind of showed in the previous slides. Okay. So in one specific example, if I go back to that quartic cost, so just the square of the pairwise distances, and you compare that square. Then here, this jxy, this kind of parametric marginal problem is what we called it, is now a quartic function. And the solutions, the optimal t, can actually be described in a completely parametric way in terms of joint moments of x and t of x. This means that I don't really need to do particle descent. I don't need to kind of optimize over this full swarm of particles. I could really just optimize over the joint moments up to, like, I think second moments is all you need here between the x's and the t of x's. And this should give kind of a much smaller optimization space that you need to search in. I will mention here that the structure of the solutions that come even from this very simple quartic problem are definitely more complicated than those that we see from PCA. In particular, the solutions are going to have discontinuities oftentimes, and they have continuities along hyperplanes that we can make very explicit in terms of these joint moments. One consequence of this fact is that the solutions that we found in the previous slide from xk-learn, which had highly oscillatory behavior on this circle, those provably cannot be optimal. Okay, so we've kind of been able to show, using this type of theory, that what scikit-learn is finding in these contexts is really not the solution. And that these particle-based kind of non-parametric methods really can't be optimizing the original energy, at least not in specific topologies. Okay. And this should, in principle, lead to better algorithms for things like these generalized multidimensional scaling problems. Okay, so now with my last kind of maybe 9 minutes or so, I want to just talk a little bit using kind of the same type of language and the same type of ideas about tSNE. So tSNE was and I think I don't have it here. tSNE was the algorithm that was able to really separate the clusters from my MNIST data set. So it's kind of considered the gold standard. It's also kind of the building block on which these algorithms that people use for like that nature graphic. That's where this was the algorithm that kind of gives those types of graphics. So how is this algorithm posed? Well, I'm going to kind of pose here a very simplified version, which describes most of the structure in the right way. What this algorithm does is it measures an affinity between 2 points xi and xj, which are in my high-dimensional space, using some kernel eta, and then I have the norm of the distance between xi and xj, and then I divide it by some number sigma I, which we should think of as some type of locally adaptive bandwidth. Okay? And this is going to define a matrix of Pijs. I put a tilde over it because we'll need to modify it slightly. Similarly, we'll measure the affinity between the embedded points, T of xi and T of xj, using a different kernel, phi, and then the distance between Txi and Txj, and we're going to call that Q tilde. And then what the tSNE algorithm tries to minimize is it tries to minimize this Kullback-Leibler divergence. So it looks at this double sum over Pij and then log of Pij over Qij. Here, I've dropped the tildes just to notice that, just to emphasize that there is a step between, which is just that I take the tilde Pi's, J's, and the tilde Q's, and I do a normalization to make them probability distributions along columns. And I also make them symmetric first, and then I do a normalization along columns so that they're probability distributions. And upon doing so, you really can interpret this as a Kullback-Leibler divergence. Okay, so the typical choice that goes into these kernels, eta and phi, that gets used particularly in this tSNE algorithm, is you pick eta to be Gaussian, and you pick phi to be a t-distribution. Those choices feel a little bit arbitrary. Why not Gaussian and Gaussian? Well, that's what tSNE did, what stochastic neighbor embedding did. And they found that it worked better if you used a t-distribution for the embedded space. Okay. So this energy here is a little bit funny because the T is hidden in a very implicit way. This Q has T dependence in it, but I don't see it in the energy. But if we do a little bit of algebra, I can actually rewrite this energy in a way where we can see all of the dependencies in a clear way. So here I can rewrite this tSNE energy as an attraction term and a repulsion term. So this attraction term would prefer that Txi and Txj be the same. And this repulsion term, because I have this inverse here, would prefer that Txi and Txj be different. Okay, now when I look at this energy here, the way that I've written it, I have these double sums. And if I were to kind of formally try to take a limit, I would expect to get double integrals as I took more and more data. And so here I would have this double integral, I'd have d mu. And then here I'd have this px1, x2, which would come from these Pijs. So that's where the dependence on the kernel, this eta, comes in. Okay. And depending on the kind of choice of P and how it scales as I collect more and more data, this is a very natural candidate for a deterministic large data limit that you would see as you gathered more and more data. This particular model for certain choices of hyperparameters was studied by Alfinger and Fletcher in the past few years. Now, tSNE does have a very important hyperparameter called perplexity. And this perplexity tries to make the entropy of the PIJs of order kappa. And the original paper actually just says, set kappa to 4 and let it go. Okay, subsequent work has tried to say, well, you need to look at different values of this perplexity to try to capture the right behavior. There's also other wrinkles that go into the optimization of this problem. There's something called early exaggeration that's actually really important for its success, and there's a lot of work that's been done. Linderman and Steinerberger, Aurora, Kai and Ma are all authors that have studied this particular phenomenon. Here, the thing that maybe I'm running out of time, so I won't say too much about it, but as I take more and more data points, if my perplexity doesn't scale like n, then my locally adaptive bandwidths have to be going to 0. And what this actually means is that my attractive term, if I Taylor expand this txi minus txj, it looks more and more like a Dirichlet energy with a scaling that looks like these sigma i's. Okay. Now, the fact that there's the sigma I in front is kind of concerning because that goes to 0 in the context that kappa isn't going like n, which is what we expect in applications. And so because of that, you can actually show that if you have a sequence of minimizers of this tSNE energy, as you take more and more data points, it actually can't converge pointwise to anything non-constant. In some sense, you need to scale your plots in a way to capture any interesting behavior. They need to scale with n in a particular way. How do you fix this? Well, there's kind of two options. One option is to try to rescale your outputs to see some interesting behavior, or to kind of understand an appropriate limiting model. This is current work with Jeff Calder, and we have some pretty good this is some pretty good starts on some analysis, which tries to identify what would happen in large data limits. Another option, which kind of makes sense from a computational perspective and also aligns with the literature on early exaggeration, is we could just rescale the attractive term by the correct amount to get rid of this sigma squared. And if you do so, you kind of get back something that looks like a classical problem from the calculus of variations, where you have some type of Dirichlet energy and some type of log repulsion. And this energy is well posed and has a nice minimizer, and you can show this using classical tools from the calculus of variations. The fact that this model can be written, maybe I'll kind of point this out here, in terms of this Dirichlet energy also suggests alternatives algorithmically for the original problem on even a discrete number, a finite number of points. And so here, this is something that we've started to pursue in collaboration with Kevin Miller, where we're looking at taking the original energy, replacing the log attraction term with now some type of weighted Dirichlet energy, where we have this this Laplace gamma is just the graph Laplacian. Okay, and so this ends up being just a graph Dirichlet energy. And there's a lot of people who have said these types of things. There's tons of numerical methods. In particular, for example, you could use some type of eigenvalue decomposition to come up with a parameterizable algorithm that uses many less parameters to do a similar sort of task and really it should approximate the same type of energy. And so kind of just a visual of the type of outputs that we can get using this type of approximation. Here, we're looking at a 2D embedding of our MNIST data set. So MNIST has something like 80,000 points. And if you were to run the standard tSNE algorithm on this data set, you would need something like 160,000 parameters, 2 for every image. Here what we've done is we've used this kind of eigenvector approximation to write down a parameterized version of the algorithm, which really only needs something on the order of 200 parameters. And it's able to cluster and kind of visualize things in just as compelling a way, but it requires, orders of magnitude less parameters to do so. And presumably could scale up and be much more efficient and also probably avoid many of the pathologies that a fully non-parameterizable algorithm does. Okay, so just to conclude very briefly, I hope I've been able to convey that dimension reduction algorithms are important in lots of applications, and especially non-convex algorithms like tSNE are very popular in many different contexts. However, these algorithms have various potential failure modes, and there's really a need for a deeper mathematical understanding of why this would happen. In the case of multidimensional scaling, we're able to kind of provide rigorous theory, which says that this really just happens because we haven't found global minima of the energy, and parametric alternatives may be able to avoid some of these pathologies. And in the case of tSNE, we've kind of taken a similar methodology to try to understand potential large data limits and to identify some good numerical algorithms that could help to do that more efficiently. There's lots of open questions, especially about tSNE regarding energy landscape, about what happens when you have constant perplexity, and also about these rescaled limits. I think that's everything that I want to say, so I'll conclude there, and thanks everybody for your attention.